Imagine a world without highways, cargo ships, or online shopping. Now, picture a vast interconnected network of trade routes stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Gulf of Mexico, where goods, ideas, and cultures flowed seamlessly. Before European explorers set foot on the continent, Native American tribes had already established one of the most sophisticated trade networks in history. This wasn't just bartering between neighbors. We're talking about an economic system so advanced that seashells from the Atlantic ended up in the Great Plains. Obsidian from the Rocky Mountains made its way to the Mississippi River, and turquoise from the southwest adorned the temples of the Aztecs. Some of these trade connections spanned thousands of miles, crossing mountains, rivers, and deserts, all without horses or metal tools. But how exactly did they pull this off? How did Native Americans build such an efficient trade system without the technology we take for granted today? Stick around as we uncover the secrets in this video. Long before Columbus and the European ships, trade was already in full swing across the Americas. Native American tribes understood the power of exchange, and their trade routes covered immense distances. Some of the earliest trade practices date back thousands of years, showing a level of economic organization that most people today don't even realize existed. Trade wasn't just about survival. It was a way of life. Different regions had access to unique resources, so tribes developed specialties. The Northwest Coast tribes, for example, had abundant cedar wood and salmon, while those in the Great Plains had bison hides and meat. The Southwest tribes mined turquoise and wove textiles. At the same time, the Eastern woodlands had access to copper and rich agricultural products. And here's the fascinating part. Trade didn't always happen through direct contact. Many tribes relied on relay trading, where goods passed from one group to another, sometimes traveling thousands of miles from their origin. A trader in the Mississippi Valley might never meet the people from the Pacific Coast. However, their goods would still reach them through a series of exchanges. Some of the earliest trade routes followed natural highways, rivers, valleys, and mountain passes. The Mississippi River, for example, acted like an ancient superhighway, allowing people to move goods efficiently. Meanwhile, foot trails connected different tribal regions, some of which later became roads used by early European settlers. But trade wasn't just about moving products, but also about building relationships. Many Native American societies had strict trade protocols, including gift-giving and ceremonial exchanges. These rituals weren't just formalities, but crucial for maintaining peace and trust between tribes. Some tribes were master diplomats when it came to negotiations. Skilled traders knew how to navigate cultural differences, ensuring that deals went smoothly. In many cases, trade agreements led to long-term alliances, creating vast networks of intertribal cooperation. But the most impressive aspect of early trade was its sheer scale. Some of these networks stretched from Canada to South America, proving that Native Americans weren't just isolated communities. They were part of a massive, interconnected system. And if you think that's impressive, wait until you hear about the Hopewell Exchange System, one of the most incredible trade networks of its time. The Hopewell people were a civilization that built one of the most influential trade systems in ancient North America. Between 200 BCE and 500 CE, the Hopewell culture thrived in the Ohio River Valley, creating a trade empire that spanned almost half of the United States. These weren't just small-scale traders exchanging goods at local markets. The Hopewell's extensive network brought in exotic materials from far and wide. We're talking about obsidian from Yellowstone, shark teeth from the Gulf of Mexico, copper from the Great Lakes, and mica from the Appalachian Mountains. But here's the mind-blowing part. Many of these goods weren't used for everyday survival. Instead, they were crafted into ceremonial objects, buried in elaborate mounds that still exist today. The The Hopewell weren't just trading for necessities, they were participating in a complex economic and spiritual system where trade was tied to religion and social status. Unlike later civilizations that relied on centralized marketplaces, the Hopewell operated through a decentralized network of trade centers. These sites acted as hubs where traders met, exchanged goods, and spread ideas. Some of these locations became massive ceremonial complexes, proving that trade was deeply intertwined with their cultural and spiritual beliefs. But how did they move goods across such vast distances without carts, horses, or boats with sails? The answer lies in their mastery of land and water routes. Hopewell traders used rivers as their main highways, paddling canoes loaded with goods. They followed a vast network of footpaths on land, many well-maintained and carefully planned. This wasn't some haphazard system. It was an incredibly efficient network that functioned smoothly for centuries. The Hopewell culture eventually declined, but their trade routes didn't disappear. Instead, they were absorbed into later trade networks, proving how enduring and influential the Hopewell system was. Let's examine the real treasures of Native American trade. What was being exchanged? This wasn't just a simple swap of everyday items. The trade networks moved goods so rare and valuable that some items traveled thousands of miles from where they were originally found. Picture a warrior on the Great Plains wearing a necklace made of seashells from the Gulf of Mexico. A chief in the Northeast smokes tobacco cultivated in the South. A medicine man in the Southwest carves an intricate figure from copper from the Great Lakes. These weren't random one-time trades. This was a full-fledged economy running smoothly across an entire continent. Each region had its specialties. The Plains tribes, known for their hunting expertise, provided bison hides, meat, and bones. These materials were essential for clothing, tools, and even ceremonial artifacts. The Pacific Northwest, rich in cedar and salmon, traded wood carvings, woven baskets, and dried fish. In the Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans controlled the flow of turquoise, a highly prized gem used for jewelry and religious purposes. Then, you had the Great Lakes region, home to massive copper deposits. Native metallurgists shaped this raw copper into knives, jewelry, and even elaborate headdresses. Meanwhile, tribes near the Appalachian Mountains had access to mica, a shiny mineral used for spiritual and decorative purposes. Let's not forget the role of agriculture. Corn, beans, and squash, often called the Three Sisters, weren't just food. They were trade staples. Farmers in fertile regions produced surplus crops, which were exchanged for tools, furs, and exotic goods. But the most fascinating trade item? Pipestone. This soft red stone was found in what is now Minnesota and was used to carve sacred pipes. These pipes weren't just for smoking. They played a crucial role in diplomacy, religious ceremonies, and peace agreements. A pipe made from this rare stone could symbolize alliances between tribes, making it one of the most respected trade items. And here's where things get interesting. These weren't just items moving along trade routes. Every object carried meaning. Some materials were considered sacred, while others symbolized wealth and power. Trade wasn't just about getting the best deal. It was a way of reinforcing cultural traditions and strengthening alliances between tribes. Let's journey through some of the biggest trade hubs in Native American history. If you think international trade is complicated today, imagine managing a system where goods had to move by foot, canoe, and hand-to-hand exchanges across thousands of miles. First, we have the Great Plains, a land dominated by bison and open grasslands. The Plains tribes were expert hunters and relied heavily on bison for food, clothing, and shelter. But bison products weren't just for local use. These tribes traded hides, bones, and meat to surrounding regions in exchange for crops, tools, and luxury goods. The plains were also home to the Black Hills, a sacred region rich in materials like pipestone. These lands became a crucial trade center where tribes gathered, exchanged goods, and maintained diplomatic relationships. These trade fairs lasted weeks and featured feasts, storytelling, and ceremonial exchanges. Next, we move to the Southwest, home to the Pueblo, Apache, and Navajo tribes. This region was famous for its turquoise, a gemstone highly valued in trade. The Southwest tribes traded turquoise for macaw feathers from Mesoamerica, showing how far their networks extended. Then, there was the Pacific Northwest, one of the wealthiest trade regions thanks to its rich supply of natural resources. The tribes in this area were expert woodworkers who crafted canoes, totem poles, and masks from cedar. But their biggest trade item? Fish, specifically dried salmon, could be transported over long distances without spoiling. In the Northeast, tribes like the Iroquois and Algonquians controlled massive trade networks through their alliances. These groups were major suppliers of furs, which became one of the most sought-after trade goods once Europeans arrived. And then there was Cahokia, the largest city in pre-Columbian North America. Located near present-day St. Louis, Cahokia was a massive trade hub with a population of up to 20,000 people. Goods from all over the continent passed through Cahokia, proving that large-scale trade existed centuries before European contact. What made all of these trade networks work? Trust, alliances, and respect. Trade wasn't just a transactional exchange, it was built on relationships. Many tribes had strict codes of honor regarding trade, ensuring that deals were fair and beneficial for both parties. Of course, trade wasn't always peaceful. Competition over resources sometimes leads to conflicts, but even then, trade networks continued to thrive, adapting to challenges in the ways that would impress even today's economists. Speaking of trust and relationships, trade wasn't just about material goods. It was deeply tied to social and political structures, with ceremonies playing a major role in solidifying agreements. Trade ceremonies varied from region to region, but they all had one goal: ensuring that the exchange was more than just an economic transaction. They were a way of building trust and maintaining alliances. One common tradition was the gift exchange. Before formal trade discussions began, tribes often exchanged gifts as a sign of goodwill. These gifts weren't always of equal value, but that wasn't the point. The act of giving showed respect and ensured that both parties entered the trade in good faith. Another major aspect of trade was the use of wampum belts. Made from intricately woven shell beads, wampum wasn't just a currency. It was a record of agreements, promises, and peace treaties. When two tribes made a significant trade deal, they often exchanged wampum belts as a symbolic contract, ensuring their agreement would be honored for generations. Then, potlatch ceremonies were practiced by tribes in the Pacific Northwest. A potlatch was a massive feast where wealth was given away rather than hoarded. The idea was simple: the more you gave, the more respected you became. Chiefs and traders hosted these events to demonstrate their generosity and status, solidifying their power within the trade network. Beyond ceremonies, trade influenced political structures. Some tribes became powerful economic hubs, controlling the flow of valuable resources. Others built strategic alliances based on trade, ensuring their people had access to necessary goods while maintaining peaceful relations with neighboring groups. Even leadership roles were influenced by trade. In many societies, the most skilled negotiators and traders held high status, not just because of their wealth, but also because of their ability to secure prosperity for their people. Trade was more than commerce. Diplomacy, social structure, and community building were all wrapped together. But with great trade power came great challenges. Managing these vast networks wasn't always easy, especially when disputes arose over land, resources, or broken agreements. As we'll see, keeping these systems running requires constant adaptation and innovation. Trade wasn't always peaceful. When valuable resources flow across vast networks, competition is inevitable. While Native American societies valued diplomacy and alliances, they weren't strangers to conflict, especially when certain tribes tried to control key trade routes or hoard valuable goods. Let's start with the Great Plains, where bison was the ultimate commodity. Tribes like the Lakota, Crow, and Comanche relied on bison for food, clothing, and tools. However, when demand for bison hides skyrocketed, especially with the arrival of European traders, territorial disputes became more intense. Tribes fought over hunting grounds, leading to long-standing rivalries that shaped the power dynamics of the plains. Further east, control over copper, flint, and other valuable materials sparked territorial disputes. The Iroquois Confederacy, one of the most dominant groups in the Northeast, expanded its influence by strategically controlling trade routes. However, this aggressive expansion led to fierce conflicts with neighboring tribes. For example, the Beaver Wars of the 1600s were fueled by competition over the fur trade, with the Iroquois battling against the Huron, Algonquin, and other tribes for control. Down south, the Mississippian culture centered around Cahokia wielded massive trade power. This prehistoric city was a major economic hub, attracting goods and traders from North America. But Cahokia's dominance wasn't without resistance. Smaller tribes often found themselves disadvantaged, forced to align with stronger groups or risk being cut off from the trade network. Some historians even suggest that internal trade disputes contributed to Cahokia's mysterious decline. However, the most intense trade-related conflicts occurred in the Southwest, where water was as valuable as gold. Puebloan societies, expert agriculturalists, relied on irrigation systems to sustain their crops. Controlling water meant controlling food, making it a major tension source. Raiding between tribes like the Apache and Navajo wasn't just about taking material goods. It was also about securing access to resources necessary for survival. Despite these conflicts, Native American trade networks didn't collapse under pressure. Instead, they adapted. Many tribes developed sophisticated diplomacy tactics to resolve disputes, relying on marriage alliances, negotiations, and gift exchanges to prevent all-out war. However, with the arrival of European traders, these conflicts took on a new level of complexity. The introduction of guns, metal tools, and alcohol changed the balance of power, allowing some tribes to gain an advantage. In contrast, others struggled to maintain their influence. As foreign powers started inserting themselves into native trade, traditional networks had to evolve quickly to survive. When Europeans arrived in North America, they didn't introduce trade to Native Americans. They entered an already thriving economic system. But their presence had massive consequences, both good and bad. At first, native tribes saw European goods as valuable additions to their existing trade networks. Metal tools, glass beads, and firearms became highly sought-after commodities. Tribes that gained early access to these goods, like the Iroquois and Dakota, used them to strengthen their influence. A simple iron knife, for example, was far more durable than traditional stone tools, giving hunters and warriors a serious advantage. Fur became the hottest commodity on the market. The European demand for beaver pelts was so high that it reshaped native economies. The fur trade turned tribes into major suppliers, with groups like the Huron and Cree thriving as middlemen between European traders and inland hunting territories. But while some tribes gained power, others faced devastating consequences. The introduction of firearms intensified existing conflicts as tribes with European allies gained the upper hand over their rivals. Wars that had once been fought with bows and spears became far deadlier. And then there was the arrival of alcohol. European traders often exchanged whiskey and rum for furs and other goods. Still, alcohol had a destructive impact on many native communities. The introduction of liquor led to addiction issues, social disruptions, and even unfair trade deals where Europeans took advantage of intoxicated negotiators. But perhaps the most damaging impact was the spread of disease. Smallpox, measles, and influenza tore through native trade hubs, wiping out entire communities. Some villages lost over 90% of their population, disrupting trade networks in ways never seen before. Despite these challenges, Native Americans weren't passive victims. Many adapted, using European goods to their advantage while maintaining their trade traditions. Some tribes played the French, British, and Spanish against each other, securing better trade deals by negotiating with multiple European powers. Others relocated, forming new trade alliances and finding ways to rebuild after devastating losses. And while European influence changed native trade, it didn't erase it. Many indigenous trade networks continued to operate well into the 19th and even 20th centuries, evolving alongside the changing world. But the biggest challenge was yet to come: the forced removal of native peoples from their ancestral lands. This wasn't just a human tragedy, but an economic disaster that disrupted centuries of trade. One of the most devastating blows to Native American trade came in the 19th century with the forced removal of tribes from their homelands. The U.S. government's policies, particularly the Indian Removal Act of 1830, shattered centuries-old trade networks, cutting tribes off from the resources and the trade routes they had relied on for generations. Take the Cherokee, for example. Before their forced relocation on the Trail of Tears, they had a sophisticated trade economy that included farming, craftsmanship, and trade with Native and European partners. They had thriving markets where goods like pottery, woven textiles, and agricultural products were exchanged. But when they were forcibly moved to Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma, they lost access to their established trade routes, farmlands, and economic centers. The same thing happened to countless other tribes. Once powerful traders on the plains, the Lakota were forced onto reservations where they could no longer freely hunt bison. This resource had been central to their trade economy. The Apache, known for their skilled trade networks across the Southwest, were confined to reservations that lacked the materials they had once traded with neighboring tribes and Mexican merchants. Forced removals weren't just about land, they were about control. By breaking up indigenous trade networks, the U.S. government weakened tribal economies, making native communities more dependent on government rations and economic systems they had no control over. But despite these challenges, native trade didn't vanish. It adapted. On reservations, indigenous artisans continued to create and sell goods, from beadwork to baskets. Some tribes rebuilt trade economies by participating in markets that catered to settlers and tourists. As the 20th century arrived, new forms of native trade emerged, including intertribal powwows, where goods and cultural traditions continued to be exchanged. Even today, native trade networks are making a comeback. Indigenous-owned businesses, online marketplaces, and cultural festivals bring back the spirit of trade that once thrived across North America. The resilience of native economies proves that, despite centuries of disruption, the foundation of trade is still alive and well in Native communities. With that, we see how Native American trade networks, once some of the world's most advanced, didn't disappear. They evolved, survived, and continue influencing modern economies in ways many don't even realize. The influence of Native American trade networks didn't disappear with the arrival of Europeans or the forced removals of the 19th century. If you know where to look, many aspects of those ancient trade systems are still visible today. Think about the roads and highways we use every day. Many of them were built on old native trade routes. The Natchez Trace, a famous trail running from Mississippi to Tennessee, was originally a trade and travel route used by the Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Natchez tribes long before European settlers ever set foot on it. The same goes for countless other roads that followed the paths of indigenous trade trails, proving that native commerce helped shape the infrastructure we take for granted today. However, the legacy of native trade is more than just roads. It's embedded in American culture, cuisine, and economy. Corn, tobacco, and even chocolate were all first cultivated and traded by Native Americans. These crops became global commodities, transforming economies around the world. When you drink a cup of hot chocolate or light up a cigar, you interact with products once central to native trade networks. And let's talk about currency. Wampum, a form of shell bead currency used by tribes in the Northeast, was so highly valued that European colonists adopted it as a legitimate form of money. Even today, wampum beads are still created by indigenous artisans, keeping the tradition alive. Native American trade networks also had a major impact on language. Many of the words we use for geographical locations, such as Mississippi, Chicago, and Missouri, come from indigenous languages that were spread through trade. Even basic words like canoe and hammock have native origins, showing how deeply trade influenced communication and culture. And then there's the modern native economy. Today, indigenous-owned businesses are booming, bringing back the entrepreneurial spirit that made ancient trade networks successful. From native-run casinos to art markets and online shops selling traditional crafts, trade is still vital to native life. Events like the Santa Fe Indian Market and the Heard Museum Guild Indian Fair and Market bring together indigenous artists and buyers worldwide, proving that native commerce is far from the past. Perhaps the most powerful legacy of native trade is its ability to adapt and survive. Despite centuries of disruption, indigenous trade networks never truly disappeared. They transformed. The same principles that guided trade centuries ago, such as reciprocity, sustainability, and respect for resources, are still present in modern native economies. So the next time you see a turquoise necklace from the Southwest, a beautifully woven Navajo rug, or even a bag of cornmeal at the grocery store, remember, these aren't just products. They're echoes of an ancient, sophisticated trade network that once connected an entire continent. And with that, we wrap up today's episode. Which story surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments. Thank you for joining us once again. We hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you will be the first to see our new updates. See you in our next video.